Welcome back, Academy I3 podcast listeners. We're very happy to bring you back for another episode. We have a great topic today focused on workforce recruitment and retention, a really important topic in our field currently that not only applies to child welfare, but it applies to a lot of just other organizations as well. So I would imagine the information that you can gather from this episode will really help enlighten just about the research piece of it, but also how it goes into practice as well. So we have a wonderful guest today. I would love to be able to turn it over to our guest to introduce herself. So Lisa, please, I turn it over to you.
Charlie, thank you so much, first of all, for having me and being interested in this topic. I think it's a most relevant topic for child welfare practitioners, leadership, particularly here in California and notably Southern California. So I am Lisa Maaca Bartlette. I'm grateful to be with you, coming to you from my home in Dana Point on Tongva territory. I appreciate that you have acknowledged the land on which you are sitting as well. I bring Native American heritage to the conversation. My father is a member of the Turtle Mountain Tribe of Chippewas in Belcourt, North Dakota. So I so greatly appreciate my affiliation with Southern Academy and how you acknowledge the land at the start of every training and every conversation. It's a really impactful and important piece of restorative justice to me personally and professionally. So, professionally, I come to you today in this conversation both as an academic. I'm halfway through a doctorate of social work degree at Barry University in Miami Shores, Florida. The focus of my studies there is the neurobiology of trauma, but also trauma-informed care, particularly in child welfare and juvenile justice organizations and agencies. Before becoming a scholar per se, I began my full-time public government child welfare practice in Ohio. So I practiced in two counties in Ohio, Cuyahoga County, home to Cleveland, and just to its west, Lorain County. And so I'll come back to maybe Lorain County practice in a little bit when we dive into our conversation. In 2017, I came west and left the Midwest where I had been born and raised my tribe. And now here in Southern California, I've practiced in the County of Orange as well as the County of San Bernardino. So since 2020, though, I have been resigned or retired from full-time public government work and of course returned to school to study, but also am a workforce trainer since 2021. So I train child welfare social workers and juvenile probation staff all over the state of California currently.
Awesome. Now we have a wonderful guest just being able to hear about your experiences and a wealth of knowledge that you bring to this conversation. And I don't know if it necessarily relates here, but I think it's pretty cool. I don't know if you want to put a plug in there for your TED Talk as well. I know that was something that I came across and I loved viewing it. So
Well,
I don't
thanks
know if you
for
want to share
watching
about
it.
that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I did deliver my first TED Talk, first and only so far, at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas this year. And you can find that on my website at lisamaaca.com and also at TED.com and on YouTube. And it's relevant to today's conversation. I discussed the power of putting people first. And in this 12-minute TED Talk, because TEDs have to be under 18 minutes, and mine was only allowed to be 12, I told the story of my first ever child welfare social work client engagement, during which time I did poorly. I was judgmental and I was responsive to some labels that this particular person had been given by social workers before me. And so the talk is all around this notion of person first language and how using person first language can support trauma-informed engagement. It can eliminate potential re-traumatization of people who have already been traumatized. And it serves us professionally to identify people as separate from their struggles. And so person first is all about person-centered, looking at another human through the lens of humanity and not pointing fingers and not judging, but rather seeing the struggles that we all have as human struggles, and that we are here to be with people in the work. And that's what social work is all about, right? It's meeting people where they are, not where we want them to be. And so as we move into today's topic, it is relevant. So I appreciate that you brought the TED up, and I'm so glad you watched it.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I know very few people who've done TED Talks, and so it's like I don't know. Like I almost see it as like a celebrity status. So in my
That's
eyes, you are a
hilarious.
celebrity.
Well, it's so funny because for over a decade, I've had a TED Talk as like something in my belly that I wanted to do. I don't even know why. But there, over 50,000 people have given a TED Talk. But when you look at the billions of people on the planet, I guess it is a celebrity smattering. So I love the idea of ideation and that there's a space for people to put their ideas out there for just the pure purpose of thought leadership, not to self-promote, not to make money off of, just to churn ideas. And I feel like, Charlie, that's what this podcast is about, right? Having
Mhm.
conversations about ideas, some of them, today's topic may be idealistic, and yet, if we break it down, it can be beyond theory and into behavior changes that are specific, that actually have an impact on people's lives
Mhm.
and can affect more positive outcomes. Again, there's lots of TED Talks out there. Thank you for listening to mine.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, perfect transition. Like you mentioned, a lot of that does transfer over to our topic today. And I think coming from the standpoint of that parallel process, like how do we want to support our internal staff in their approach in supporting external staff? And a lot of it does come back to just that person-centered, what is individualized for that person. And I would imagine some of that does come back to this topic of like retention and turnover, especially when it comes to what is the individualized motivation for each person to want to stay where they're at and also their organization's support of that. So I think where we can first start is around research. So I would imagine there's some themes or research around retention that maybe you can start to speak to.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a good place to start, and we'll move out of maybe research into more practical conversations. But the research comes from, right, actual studies, and some of them ethnographic, meaning the researcher inserted themselves in a child welfare agency to become one with the staff and learn from the inside out the thoughts and practices and frustrations and themes of workforce retention. So I've written a couple of papers on this. Neither are published yet, but I cite a lot of authors. And of course, if you want to make those available in the show notes afterwards, feel free. But yeah, when we're looking in the last decade to 15 years on the impact of child welfare training, as well as organizational practices, there are some notable themes that are extracted for why workers stay, right? Why people who sign up to do this very challenging work that doesn't have longevity for a lot. Our numbers are not great as far as people that do this work for years and years and retire out of a public government child welfare agency system. But those that stay and those that do continue do so because there's a supportive environment. So this includes not just the work with the families, but notably relationships intercollegiately, coworkers, and organizational leadership. There's this sub-theme that comes out of this research that says that there's a sense of value and belonging within the agency that workers have because one, they get provided the support that they need. There's a learning environment, meaning there's opportunities for them to grow and move up professional ladders, upward mobility, and there's a personal connection to the work. So many of us come to this work meaning intentioned. We care for families. We want children safe. And we love the work that we do. Yet so many of us leave for reasons we'll get to in a minute. So the ones that stay really have this personal connection to the work, stays personal because they are supported in the work that they do. Opportunities in the agency, as I mentioned, professional development, but also job security, and then new and innovative positions that allow people to move, not just laterally, but upward as well. This to me is the most notable of all the research because I'm a former supervisor and I have a special place in my heart for supervisors in child welfare. But the quality of supervision is the third most mentioned reason for workers staying on the job. So multiple studies in the last couple decades show supervision is the top motivation for caseworkers. I've extracted a couple of statements, if you don't mind me sharing from some of the qualitative research. Here's one quote: supervisors can make or break you. And I've lived this one, both as a worker and as a supervisor. And I had some hard lessons as a supervisor where I had staff that would said I was the best supervisor ever, and I had others that would on the verge of quitting unless they got a new supervisor. So this dynamic is a powerful one for workers. Here's another quote: knowing my supervisor has my back. So this element of supervisors not just being in a hierarchical position, overseeing the work of their workers, but really being willing to be in the work with them. Not meaning they're driving out to every home with their workers, but if there's a need that they can back them up when circumstances, it makes sense to do that. And then here's a quote: supervisors who are willing to get their hands dirty, so to speak. And you have to have done this work, I think, to understand that term in context, right? But again, a supervisor who's not just going to sit in their office with the door shut and do consultations, but really understands and is willing to continue to be curious and learn and grow and go into the field and the work with their workers. So those are the main themes that come out of why people stay. When we look at some themes for the high rates of turnover, and there are high rates of turnover all over the United States. Some of our states, Georgia in particular, have extremely high turnover rates compared to other states. And here in Southern California, we've seen since a little before the pandemic, some of these rising turnover rates as well. So some of the themes for that, and again, this is from the research. This isn't Lisa says, this is from the research. Organizational issues. So things like low pay, challenging work demands, including high caseload, system issues, such as feeling that management is data-driven rather than needs-driven. And I know that's probably a conversation to parse out and maybe for another time, because data is important. In fact, I'm sharing with you from the data right now. But oftentimes workers feel disconnected from the data. And so there's a disconnection from management's directives and intentions to how things are heard, felt, and responded to by staff. Collaboration issues, right? Social workers and child welfare is just one of the systems that's involved in this work. We have juvenile dependency courts with lawyers and people that see the world a little differently than social workers do. And we have lots of other professionals, mental health, school, probation, you name it. When you're a child welfare social worker, you touch almost every other profession that exists out there in your work with families. And we do see things differently often. So managing those conflicts, attempting to collaborate takes its toll on many a social worker. One quote that comes out of the qualitative research is, everything feels like a crisis. And when you're already in crisis response, like your job is responding to the hotline's immediate response call, you've got to be on the scene within 2 hours because there is a crisis and kids aren't safe. When everything else in the agency also feels like a crisis, that's a lot of stress to navigate. And a human being's nervous system can only tolerate so much at one time without recovery. So there's those dynamics that have their effect on what we would call burnout, overwhelm, and some of the things that lead to workers quitting. The culture of tension and fear has been mentioned in the research, and this is something maybe we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to the term psychological safety. But again, I got to mention this: unresponsive supervision, This theme comes out in every research study that I read and have written about, where the aspect of supervision is key not only in workforce retention, but notably in turnover and why people leave. Stress and burnout is a separate category, even though I've mentioned it as part of organizational issues. But this lets maybe move it more into the micro, right? The individuals that are resigning or quitting. Why? Inadequate time to complete required tasks. So the overwhelm of having so much to do, the demands that it's due now, it's due now, it's due now, but not the time, or maybe not the time management skills developed to complete that. Management's judgment when workers ask for overtime. So maybe it's not a time management issue. Maybe it's too much work and not enough time to do it. And then the pressure that you feel when you bring that up or your overtime gets denied, those type of stressors. Feeling unsafe on the job, both physically and psychologically. And again, this is a crisis response role. And so we are not firefighters, but we are coming in hot and running in hot into some hot situations, right? Where there is chaos and there is potential for unsafe situations. And so, how do we prepare a workforce for that? How are we proactive versus reactive? And so, what's mentioned in the research is that it feels sometimes like agencies are reactive to those safety issues. I did want to mention the impact of the work then on a person's personal life. So, stress and burnout comes down again to an individual person who is a human and has a life outside of work. And so, this is the kind of work because we are marching into homes and lives that have trauma, unresolved trauma. And we say this in trauma-informed social work practice training. We say there's no way that you can walk through water and not get wet. There's no way that you can walk in and out of conversations about witnessing firsthand the trauma of other people and in their especially children's lives and not feel and take some of that and have that impact on you, no matter how good your boundaries are, right? Because if we care and we're showing up in a way to help, then we are going to feel some of that. And so this is a whole construct that's studied separately, but it's called secondary traumatic stress. And so the impact of STS, secondary traumatic stress, is profound. And if there isn't an outlet for an individual or a team or an agency to process those stressors, they accumulate. They don't just go away because the day is over, the case is closed. They accumulate. And so we see stress and burnout is the accumulation of that without having an outlet for recovery. So again, a couple of quotes from the qualitative research. Quote, "I am so overwhelmed. I can't tell you how many times I've compromised my personal life and my own family for my caseload. The nightmares I dream of my cases." So the stress of travel, and when we look at some of our California counties, I'm thinking of my most recent employment in San Bernardino County. It's the largest geographical county in the United States. It's larger than Rhode Island. Some of my workers had families that were hours away, and they were expected to carry the same amount of cases as workers whose families were local or within close proximity. And I know counties are working hard to address this, to look at the caseloads and look at them not just through the lens of numbers, but through the lens of how challenging they are to serve and service. So that's one of the themes. And then, of course, there's another one, which is demographics, right? This is the reason that people leave the work is they were Title IV-E. They came into the work with a scholarship given to them during their master's program. They owe the state a year or two, and then their obligation is done. And so knowing that they've got other things on their professional agenda. Um, a lot of workers come in here before they perhaps marry or start a family or things like that. And so those demographic dynamics really change. How do you continue to do the work of intervening with little ones that are harmed when you've got little ones at home? And that struggle is real, and some navigate it beautifully. I'm in awe of those that can, but not everyone can or wants to. And then many take a job in child welfare early on or early out of their education, intending to maybe get a clinical license and hang a shingle and do private practice or something else. So there's that. And I want to mention this. In fact, this is one of my former professors that conducted a study in 2021, Dr. Jeffrey Steen. He was the first one, I think, to really look at this. And I think he had two co-authors on this study. So he surveyed over 5,500 licensed social workers across 13 states, and he looked at ACE scores, so adverse childhood experiences that were had by social workers who signed up to do the work of child welfare intervention on children who are accumulating ACE scores because they've been abused and neglected. And so it's a pretty fascinating study to me. I think anecdotally, we've known that many people come to do this work because they've had their own lived experiences and they want to change the world that we live in. They were abused or neglected, or somebody they know was, and so they're here to do differently. So notably, social workers have report more than 24% exposure to more than 24% of respondents reported an exposure to four or more ACEs. And so these are higher figures than workers in most populations and in other industries, if you will. And so why is this important, right? ACEs are negatively associated with wellness and workplace issues, including physical health, mental health, struggles with substance misuse, and workplace stress. So if we're looking at a population, a workforce population that's coming in already taxed with their own trauma to do trauma work, it stands to reason that trauma work may have a greater impact, right? Not for everybody. Again, it's not like we bring all our unhealed stuff to the workplace, but you mentioned a parallel process, and I think that's an important thing to talk about. How and when does a new social worker recognize, deal with their own things that come up as they begin to do this work? And then how do agencies and supervisors support this workforce as they continue to do that work and as they're navigating their own personal stressors along the way?
Yeah, no, I think all that together, it really highlights that there's so many dynamics to this. There isn't just one key that's going to solve this whole entire system, but there's really so many parts that are going to impact that system. And so I think something I've heard before when I was a previous coach to social workers is that how things used to be done when it came to social work, where it's okay, like it felt easier or it felt easier in the sense of like the workload. And it felt like there wasn't so much of this that was going on, or we could just push through. However, whatever the case may be now, there's so many different impact points that's making it harder to just push through. And I think some of the things you spoke about, which is paying attention to one's well-being, having that support from the supervisor to individualize their care for their direct reports, to have check-ins like, hey, like how are you doing? How's the workload for you? How are you tending to your well-being? And also there's the other more overseeing piece of it, which is the organizational leadership of how they can promote that to be the case, despite all the workloads and other demands that are part of it too.
Yeah, and that's probably the greater challenge right there. We have had training for social workers called trauma-informed social work practice for a long time now. The expectation is that the workers offer families trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care, however, is a system intervention. And it only works if everybody from the top down is bought in. And are we creating trauma-informed systems for the workers who are going to offer trauma-informed practice to families? Or is there a disconnect? You go do trauma-informed social work practice, but when you come in here, we don't have a consideration for the trauma exposure. We have top-down hierarchical systems. So yeah, and I know these are conversations that are being had in many different ways, and it looks differently in different places because of populations, culture, size of agencies, size of populations, workforce. When I began my practice in Lorain County, Ohio, full-time practice, I practiced in Cuyahoga County as an intern. But when I came to Lorain County, Ohio, so very small population, everything in Ohio is smaller than California, but Lorain County was unique in a couple of ways. One, they've been called the heroin capital of the United States by the BBC. Huge opioid crisis. And I began there in the I think 2016. We hired only master's level social workers. And we tasked every worker with a one worker model, meaning one social worker assigned to the hotline who works the case all the way to closure, even if that means to adoption. And the idea there was that we would offer our families stability in that they get one social worker. And I know there's pros and cons on both sides of the siloed versus a one worker model. That's not the point of the conversation. The point was the agency from a top down perspective adopted trauma informed care as an agency for its workers and its population. So what did that look like? First of all, before I could even get hired, I signed up and said, yeah, I want to be a child welfare social worker. And they said, that's great, but we're going to pay you for 2 days to ride around with a social worker who's actually doing the work and responding to IRs, immediate responses, right? Responding to crises. And you're going to ride along and you're going to go to court with this worker and you're going to see and feel what it's like before we even invite you to accept a job. So paid time to see if this is even a job I'd want. That's a lot of output and money and investment by an agency and potentially people who will never work for them. And yet I can tell you how many people that saved from one signing up for a job they really didn't want to do, weren't going to commit to, and saved the agency from having that workforce in place that then they would pay for their core training and all of this before they even had time managing families. Or Lorain County also did something unique in the one worker model and in that piece, in that we had a kind of a wraparound for our social workers. So what did this look like? If there was a fatality on my caseload or in my unit, the assigned caseworker was mandated to have 3 days off. So just like you get for bereavement, that was a requirement for self-care to step away from, allow you to feel the grief and the loss and the pain that you inevitably would feel, having worked so closely with a family and had that negative outcome, and to process all of that nervous system, emotions before you come back to a role that requires you to be in your critical thinking prefrontal cortex at all times, right? And so there's a healthy perspective that the agency took as to what a healthy workforce looks like. And they invested in that. Again, that's dollars that get spent to support a workforce environment. So we'll probably talk more about what agencies can do to improve trauma-informed care, but this is a system-wide piece that's important for the conversation today.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think providing that sort of anecdotal experience that you talked about with Lorain County, I think that's certainly one concept or one idea that I'm sure that's been brought up, but I think the consideration of that, what would that look like if I were to adopt that for my own county? And I think that's even this mindset that I would invite others to even consider is what's our openness to consider ideas such as this? Because I think a lot of times, like the initial piece of it, oh, that's an idea, it's not going to work. But what if you had these ideas that were presented to you? What would it look like to then consider that and adopt that? And I think you spoke about something perfectly, which is the expectation. What is the expectations for the workers who are potentially coming in, and how does that match with their introduction of the job or what the job truly is versus what their perception of that?
Yeah, thank you for drawing that out of what I said. Both definitely worth sitting with. When I train new social workers, I just did this training last week, so I'm trying to remember the topic. I think it's on our structured decision-making model here in California. We use an assessment tool throughout the process so that we have more fair and equitable perspectives going into our work with every family. But there's one slide in that slide deck, and I always sit with the last point with the learners a little bit longer than usual. And it says, expect uneven paths, right? Expect an uneven path and create expectations for that. And sometimes I say, I think this is the most important point on all the slides in all of core. And they look at me like I have two heads. But it comes from, I think this is a Buddhist principle where when expectations are set here and the experience that we actually have is here, what is this in the middle? It's called pain and suffering. And so we as humans have very little control over most of our experiences. And as a child welfare social worker, if it's a full moon, you can count on a little bit more activity. But other than that, every day's different. You don't know what you're walking into most days. So experience is going to be all over the map. But what do we have a lot of control over? Setting expectations. If I leave anywhere in California and I expect to get somewhere in 30 minutes and it's a 30-mile trip, my expectations are out of line. I'm from Ohio, 30 miles takes 30 minutes. When I came to California, I had to adjust those expectations. It's a silly example, but do you know what happens when I do this? I spend 2 hours regulated. I don't get somewhere full of road rage and angst and dysregulated walk into whatever my next thing is. We have a lot of power as leaders in organizations, as supervisors, managers, as caseworkers in setting expectations. And I think it's one thing that, like what you just touched on, not every agency, most agencies can't do what Lorain County did. Lorain County was sponsored every year after year. Taxpayers paid an extra tax to support the agency because they believed so much in helping families struggling with the opioid crisis. It's different here, right? But being open-minded to, I wonder what trauma-informed care could look like, feel like, and behaviors could actually be. And one of the most powerful opportunities we have in any realm in our life is setting expectations. And if expectations come closer to the actual experience, guess what? Less pain and suffering, less worker burnout, less turnover. Truly. Sounds idealistic, but it's a powerful thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, 'cause I've heard too many a times where like newer workers will come in and they're like, this is not at all what I expected. And it's how much more front loading could there be providing or just clarity of, hey, this is what it would look like, not only just for generally a social worker, but for a social worker working in this county, working with this population, working with however many in this caseload, like really more clarity around that.
Yeah, and it's challenging. They've got a lot they're contending with, and it looks different all over California. In Southern California, we do most of the pre-training up front. We load them up with training before they touch a family on their own, have their own caseloads or families assigned to them. And there's some wisdom in that, and there's pros and there's cons. In some of our other California counties, which are more sparsely populated, not as many workers, they're struggling with retention as well and turnover. Workers come on and they get assigned families right out of the gate, and they spread out their training over the course of a year. And there's reasons for all of that. And it looks differently, but there's a lot to be said for knowing what you're getting into before you've been in training for 6 months. And then the agencies invested, the counties invested in all of that training, but you don't have a flippant idea what the work's going to feel like or be like. And then you're shell shocked. So, yeah, how do we move workers more honestly, authentically into the work and set those expectations? Because it is hard work
Hmm.
and it's not for everybody. And yet we desperately need more people to do it.
Yes. Now, I think we've definitely talked a lot about just now the research and also what it would look like for newer workers as they're coming in. I think now if we could transition a little bit to we have current workers who are in place and finding ways to support them. And I think an important topic that you wanted to bring in today was just around psychological safety and that trauma-informed care piece, especially as what you've mentioned, a system-based change, not so much just individualized. So yeah, if you can start to speak more about that.
Yeah, thank you. These are two of my most passionate topics. So keep me on track here, Charlie, and not get too far into ideology or theory, because both of them are behavioral interventions. They're not just theoretical. They're built on theoretical models from decades ago, but implementation across disciplines is widespread and the outcomes are well documented. So psychological safety, like trauma-informed care, has become a bit of a catchword or catch term that's being thrown around a lot. So I want to be really clear about what it is and maybe what it is not. So psychological safety was coined by Amy Edmondson in research in the 1990s, where she looked at teams that work together in organizations. And so this term means that teams at work are characterized by mutual respect and interpersonal trust that creates a healthy friction that does not always feel good in the moment. This is the shared belief that team members can speak up, take risks, and make mistakes without the fear of negative consequences. So, another phrase that I really like, and this is not mine, this is somebody else's. I think this came from the Harvard Business Review, an environment of rewarded vulnerability. So, what does that mean? In a psychologically safe environment, people feel comfortable around 4 stages. So, there's 4 stages of psychological safety. And the first we call inclusion safety. So, this is where people feel that they belong, right? They belong. This is foundational, right? So, how do we make people feel welcome? How do we have people know that you belong here? Diverse people belong here, right? Inclusivity, we all belong. The second stage of psychological safety we call learner safety. So this is where I can ask questions. I feel comfortable asking for help. I can say things like, oh my gosh, I don't know. Help, help, help. Where can I go for help? Gosh, I know you've been around here a lot longer than I have. Can you show me? I'm so new, everything feels overwhelming. Where can I go for some help on this? So, this notion to encourage and practice curiosity. So, that learner mindset that we hear so much about versus that expert mindset that's all about being right, getting it right. And if not, what's wrong with you? So psychological safety is not about what's wrong. It's what did you learn? What am I learning? How can I learn? Third stage of psychological safety we call contributor safety. So this is where a team member can, anyone on the team can say, I heard you. Here's my thoughts. I have an idea, right? They're open to, we want to foster passion. We want to inspire innovation. We want our workers to think outside boxes and be comfortable sharing that in a team group. And then there's this fourth aspect of psychological safety we call challenger safety. So this is, again, have you considered where we're able to challenge the status quo? Again, so ideas get heard. Doesn't mean they get taken and used, but they get heard. In other words, psychological safety promotes a work space where people can bring their full selves to work, their authentic selves. What psychological safety is not, and this gets misinterpreted often, it is not a shield from accountability. So this is not hiding behind an accommodation, right? It's not people pleasing. It's absolutely psychological safety encourages and expects accountability, but the accountability that can also show up and say, doggone it, I put all this effort out there. We did this research project and it didn't pan out. What can we do differently going forward? What psychological safety is not, it's not niceness. It's not a culture of go along to get along or some Pollyanna false harmony. And a lot of our spaces, like our work, social services, we see this too in like social service nonprofits, maybe churches, faith-based, where the motivation for people working is a feel-good motivation. And so sometimes that goes toward niceness, where we just want everyone to feel good and be happy. And so we ignore accountability, or we look the other way, or we're afraid to say the hard thing. That's not psychologically safe because we like each other. Psychological spaces are also not coddling, and they're not consensus decision making. In other words, it's not necessary, it's not a democracy where everyone's going to get a vote and we take the most votes, but it's more a consultative decision making space where everybody ought to feel like they belong, their voice is important, their thoughts are important. We want to hear what you have to say. We want all ideas aired. But then there is a decision maker, and it may not always go the way you want it to. So it's not consensus decision making. The term that we use is consultative decision making. What psychological safety is not, it's not unearned authority. Does productivity matter? Do outcomes matter? Yeah, they matter. We have work to do. We have families to serve. There are cases that should be closed. We don't want to be here with families forever, right? There's a lot of dynamics and reasons for us to have an authority that makes decisions, experience in the workforce. When I was a brand new supervisor, I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm in over my head. Being a worker and a supervisor are two very different things. And there was a massive learning curve the first year or so as a supervisor in recognizing the different roles and the authority that I now had and had to step into. So we've got to create space for growth across all roles and recognize what they are. So what psychological space is not is unearned authority. It's also not political correctness. And most importantly, it is not rhetorical reassurance. So what is that? Me standing up in front of a room and saying, this is safe space. Announcing that it's psychologically safe space because, I don't know, we have some group agreements on the wall and we're social workers and I said so. So you don't walk into a room, and I've been in the room where I've been in many settings where the leader walks in and tries to get people's engagement by saying simply, this is psychologically safe space, or I want to create a safe space. Of course, we want elements of safety to be present in all of our spaces, but that's up to leadership to create. And it is something that gets created and built and demonstrated before there's buy-in from the people in those spaces. So I don't want us thinking that we can create safe, psychologically safe spaces by announcing we're we've got psychological safety at the top of our strategic plan and our agenda. Psychologically safe spaces are built by modeling behaviors of leadership. So an element of psychological safety is trust, but trust is a separate construct, and trust is developed between individuals, right? I will learn to trust you over time. Trust is earned. In team spaces, it's an element of that. I need to learn and be able to trust the people I'm working with and for, and upon that trust, then I can lean in to harder conversations. I feel more comfortable bringing up questions and ideas. So the challenge here is that even if we buy into this ideologically, it's got to be practiced from management, administrative, leadership down or around is how I prefer. But most of our government's child welfare agencies are set up in a hierarchical structure. And so it's something that needs to be demonstrated with vulnerability from the top and willingness to be curious and learn and not always get it right. And then leadership who, when they sit down with a worker who's struggling or has something to announce that's not what we were wanting to hear, says, okay, tell me what you learned. Or looks at the group, the work group, and says, boy, that was rough. We were not hoping to end up here. What are we learning? What have we learned? And really leaning in with curiosity to listen to what's been learned so that moving forward, we can maybe do things differently and not return to that poor outcome. Psychological safety comes to us also through the work of Dr. Susan David. I really love her work for lots of reasons. She's the author of a book called Emotional Agility, but she looked into Amy Edmondson's research and continued it. And this is the extraction. They originally looked at teams that work together in hospitals. Crisis intervention, medical crises, life saving. They've all signed to the Hippocratic Oath, I will do no harm. First, do no harm. And remarkably, the teams that demonstrated more psychological safety had longer workforce retention, were more successful overall, were the teams that admitted early on where they messed up. They had more mistakes that were noted. Why? Workers felt like they could name their mistakes. And once named, they could learn from them. Versus a culture where it is performance based and not open to learn from mistakes. In fact, saying I messed up is not okay. We hide mistakes, right? To only show preferable outcomes. And so those are actually the hospital teams that did more poorly because mistakes weren't brought to the surface, so they couldn't be learned from. So psychological safety is all around this notion of showing up fully in our work, which I think is so important in child welfare, because most of the workers I've led, worked with, learning from, and teach and train, they sign up to do this work because they feel called to do it. There's some deeply motivated compassion and belief that this is what I'm supposed to be on this earth doing. So they're very much aligned with purpose. And how do we continue to foster a place where that passion can grow and their ideas can be invited and welcome?
Yeah, that was a great answer. Very, I think with psychological safety, it's something that you said it's built upon, it's developed before you can actually put it out there. Yes, now we're stepping into it. It's not just like a blanket statement that you could just put in front of a classroom or anything like that. So I think now, as we're approaching our sort of final section of our time together, I'm sure our listeners are really wanting to hear a lot more about the strategies that can help improve workforce retention. Now, before we get into that, I know a connection piece you wanted to draw to was trauma-informed care. So if you can start with that and then dive into our strategies.
Yeah, trauma-informed care and psychological safety to me go hand in hand, but they are two different kind of concepts. And trauma-informed care, again, is this model of care that really came out of Sandra Bloom's sanctuary model from. So it can be used in a variety of professions. We train and teach trauma-informed care in all kinds of professions, including child welfare, social work. Guiding principles are safety, trustworthiness or transparency, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, voice, and choice. I'm sure to all our listeners, this sounds familiar because this is the work that we do with families around the child and family teaming. And then cultural, historical, and gender issues. So, yeah, this is a nice talk we're having, Lisa, about what can we do differently to create safer spaces, physically safe and psychologically safe, because they're both important. In fact, physical safety is necessary as a foundation to have emotional and interpersonal safety as well. And that is the number one key principle, guiding principle of trauma-informed care. So I've seen a lot of practices implemented across the United States, both in the research and firsthand, including what I mentioned in Lorain County, where they've got these levels of intervention and support for staff members who are struggling, right, because of the exposure to trauma. Let me mention a few recommendations and strategies here. Of course, one of the reasons people leave is low pay. And I know that some of the states in the United States, I'm not sure where all of our California counties fall, but are really looking to see how they can invest in their workers more strongly and increase paychecks, particularly equivalent to education. I've got almost a doctorate now, and I look at what some other professions make that have the same level of education, and there's quite a disparity, right? And we're doing crisis intervention work. We're running into situations that put ourselves at quite a risk. So as counties look at what they can do to retain competitive pay, along with that, of course, healthcare benefits and leave. I think we really could revisit the notion of leave and perhaps expand it given the type of work that we do. For example, the Lorain County situation where there was a fatality on someone's caseload or any critical incident, allow the worker and invest in the worker to have time and space for that. One county in Southern California that I'm aware of, there may be others, have brought on a therapist to be available with no fee, right, to workers in the office. And there's other trauma-informed interventions I've seen that really do boost the workers feeling supported. One deputy director would bring in a therapy dog on a couple scheduled days a month and have opportunity for workers to just go hang for a half an hour and have that connection with creature comfort. It doesn't feel like a lot, but man, was that meaningful. Man, was that meaningful, because what the workers, the staff were like, she sees me, she listened to me. And so many of us really do rely on our creature comforts for some regulation. So why not have that available in the office? Speaking of regulation, we talk a lot about self-care. We train a lot about self-care. Almost everywhere that I hear that conversation, especially in agencies where they're looking at their workers and go, how's your self-care? They're talking about what do you do outside of work. So people talk about their massages, their mani-pedis, their golf game, their exercise, whatever. There is always outside of work. And when I invite people into this conversation, I'm like, okay, that's nice. But when your manager and county council is outside your office door and the court report is overdue and the family just lost their housing, what does self-care look like in that moment? So self-regulation, moving the conversation away from self-care and outside work into what does self-regulation look like for our workforce who is engaged in toxic stress situations? Do we have a quiet room? Is there a place where they can go on their break with the lights out and desensitize from all that sensory overload? Again, practical pieces that we could consider. Training and professional development, mentorship programs, and coaching. I am coaching now in another academy, but with supervisors and managers. And I just had a coachee look at me and say, "Man, I just bumped into one of my colleagues and mentioned that I have this coaching thing going on." And they were like, "I didn't know that was available." And so just that bit of support. And I know in Southern California, we have coaches, you've been one of them, Charlie, that can offer this kind of third-party support, right? They're not employed by the agency. There's an element of psychological safety there where you can be a little more open with your struggles and that doesn't get reported and that sort of thing. So providing those types of supports. Of course, making manageable caseloads. I mentioned in Lorain County, we had the one worker model, and that was hard, right? On any given day, I was responding to a crisis, or I was testifying in open court on an ongoing case, or maybe even attending an adoption for a child that had been on my caseload for a year and a half. But our caseloads were very low. And they were purposefully that way so that we could give the families the attention, the time that was necessary given the one worker model. And I know that's the struggle with retention, that's poor. And the high turnover rates, we're just trying to get in workers, right? Train. We just need them so desperately. What can we do to support the ones that we have? Right? So what are ways we can maybe triage when we bring in referrals and again, manage caseloads? So supportive supervision and leadership, I can't say enough about. This goes along with peer support as well. But I know you've got, I think that is a topic for an upcoming academy. And I think my colleague Betsy Watson is your guest to talk about that. So I'm going to leave that in her much more capable hands for that conversation. But man, is that huge. So anyone that's really interested in doing something today in your county, if you've got the power and leadership to bring in and advocate and create peer support groups, huge. How can we improve organizational culture? Well, trauma-informed care is not just something social workers go do with families. I know I've said it already, but from the person that greets families at the front door, even security, everybody in the organization needs to have a basic understanding of what trauma is, what trauma responses look like, and how we can de-escalate potential situations by recognizing where people are. Crisis Prevention Institute is one of the national organizations that is training people, including child welfare social workers in some of our California counties, on nonviolent crisis intervention. And I think that's something that we could do a better job of in our counties, where we, the responders, recognize, and staff in all the agency recognize when somebody is in anxiety and distress versus a ramped up behavior that needs a safety intervention. So if we are going to meet people where they are, we've got to recognize where they are. And so we've got to build people's awareness, all of our people, not just our social workers, around what do these behaviors look like in folks. When they're agitated, they're distressed, they're anxious, but they're not escalated to somewhere where we need to have a safety intervention. So that's a really important conversation. I think our counties could do a better job at having and teaching and training. And then we don't waste resources. We don't have one person in an amped up, dysregulated nervous system coming in at another person. And so what does restoration look like? What does repair look like? What does tension reduction look like? Those ought to be our aims, right? Recognizing that trauma's on a spectrum and we're all on it. And the trauma-informed question that we ought to be asking of people, maybe not directly at them, but at least in our minds before we engage is, I wonder what happened to you that this is how you're showing up right now. Instead of, what's wrong with you? Stop that, calm down, do differently. So trauma-informed care, and this was in my TED Talk, says this, that before we expect behaviors to change, we first must recognize our role in helping people to feel seen, heard, and understood. And that's everybody. I need to feel seen and heard and understood, Charlie, in order to perform and do well, right? Leaders, right? Everybody, every human needs to feel seen. So, trauma informed care, psychological safety are these terms, but what they really describe are behaviors that you and I can demonstrate day in and day out to the people we work with and the people we work on behalf of that help people feel seen. I get it, you're struggling, right? So we start with some validation before we say, you need to stop that. So there's this whole kind of dynamic that morphs into our agencies. And of course, it's dependent on the humans that are in the systems, but some of them are demonstrated from leadership down. And so when we change that mindset and change that dynamic and start asking and creating spaces where people can be more curious and less condemning of others, I think we're on a good path.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like you were reading my mind. I'm just like, what are some final takeaways that you would like to share? And I feel like you really spoke to that. And I think another piece that I will add on to that too is, when I was in my coaching role, and even to some extent now in my current role as supervisor, like I think about how the intersection of what I do outside of my work at the academy is, which is a therapist. And so, like, I think to some extent, what I brought in as a coach, what I bring in as a super is this therapeutic approach to how we care for others. And I think that's sometimes can be a missing link in a lot of these different spaces is like that, like you said, the self-regulating, the understanding of individualized trauma, and also just like how do we genuinely care for others in a very therapeutic and healing way. And I think bringing this all together, we definitely had a wonderful conversation about some different ideas, some different concepts. Is there a final takeaway that you would like to just allow our listeners to just
Yeah.
reflect on, to be able to think through as we start to move and finish with this conversation?
Yeah, I'm thinking about a comment one of my probation officers made at the end of a trauma-informed care training and gently raised their hand and said, Lisa, silly girl, silly trainer, trauma-informed care is what you do, right? That's what healers do. That's what social workers do. That's what therapists do. And I said, okay, I get that. I get why it feels that way because their job is what? Keeping peace in a detention center, right? With minors who have committed crimes of all kinds, right? Their job is often restraints and pat downs and hard things like that. And I said, trauma informed care is not what we do, it's how we do everything. How you hold space for another person speaks more to what that person is going to give back to you than anything. I have power to co-regulate a dysregulated space if I can stay regulated. I have power, if you will, to empower another human being by creating a space where they feel like they belong. They can ask questions, they can share ideas, right? I have power in advocating with my families. How I show up with a family says more to that family as to whether they're going to lean in and receive the help and the services that are being offered than my competence, whether I checked all the boxes, how many degrees I have, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, are we hiring a lot of people that maybe don't have social work backgrounds or degrees? The workforce is changing a little bit. To your point, yes, we've got to teach and show people what a therapeutic alliance feels like, what an integrated experience with somebody who is calm, cares, and accountable. It's going to hold the line. What does that feel like? So, show me is what psychological safety is about, not tell me, show me.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Yeah, Thank you so much. I have a lot of regard for you, and I can just feel just I don't know, just this exuding of energy and how much you care about this topic and how much you care about the work that you do, just in you talking about this. So thank you just so much for being here, for being a guest on this episode. And I'm sure our listeners are going to get something that they could take away from this, that they can mull over, think about, and find a way to integrate.
I hope so. Thanks, Charlie, for having me.
Of course. So yes, thank you so much, Academy I3 listeners. We hope to invite you back to our next episode. I'm sure we have a few more this season, and we look forward to having you join in. Take care, and we'll be back with you soon.